Uh, Welcome everybody. Hopefully you're not sweating to death here, but once the sun goes down, it'll hopefully be a little bit cooler. So, Bonnie and I have known each other for a long time and worked together really from two different angles in trying to accomplish the same mission, and that is to find better therapies and cures for patients with lung cancer. And really a critical part of that is matching the right drugs to the right patients, and hence we're strong advocates of genotyping and making sure all the genomic information is known from patients. But I wanted to start by asking Bonnie, as you heard from Rick, that she's a long-term survivor of lung cancer, what it was like when you were diagnosed with lung cancer. What was the world like, and was testing talked about then, and et cetera? Why don't you tell us a little bit?
Okay, awesome. I was diagnosed 13 years ago. Had a tumor on my aorta and my subclavian artery, and I was told to get my affairs in order. There was nothing that could be done for me. Well, that wasn't the answer I was looking for. So I kept looking, and I found an amazing thoracic surgeon at UCSF. His name is David Jablons. He's crazed and like a balloon letting out air, but he was the perfect person for me. He put together a really aggressive chemotherapy radiation program for me, and they were able, after a 14-hour surgery with 3 surgeons, to get that tumor out of my chest. And I promised myself at the time that if I made it through that knothole, I would do something about that kind of diagnosis and do something to change it. So that was 13 years ago. It was Christmas of 2004. Tarceva was in clinical trial. So the only thing available for a lung cancer patient was carboplatin, cisplatin, Taxol. That was it. There wasn't anything else. Luckily, it worked for me for a very short time, enough to pull it away, and then David went in there with his chopsticks and did a great job. So one thing I want to leave you with today, and then I'll give the mic back to Pasi. In light of that, and considering that we're with an amazing company here tonight, Garden, that's doing amazing things with blood-based biopsies and testing. More drugs have been approved for lung cancer in the last 15 months than have been approved in the last 4 decades. So I was pretty hopeless, and patients like myself were pretty hopeless back in Christmas of 2003 or 4. My daughter will correct me. But now we can see hope. Hope is on the horizon.
So tell me a little bit about the foundation. What do? You talk to patients a lot, and tell us a little bit about what do patients ask you, and what kind of advice do you give them or make them think about?
Okay. That's a great question. We have a lot of patient programs in the first foundation, and we're also doing research in the second foundation. So we're heavily involved in every area of lung cancer. But my favorite part is working with patients. We have a thing we call the living room. It's a patient support education program. And we were reaching so many people, they were lined up outside our office. We have a guest speaker come in once a month to talk to patients about everything from genomic testing to surgical to brain radiation, you name it, we do it. It was so popular, we asked ourselves, how can we duplicate this in other areas? It's so important because educated and empowered patients live longer. They just do. So we went through a process asking lots of people. We ended up live streaming it, and we're now live streaming this program to 143 countries around the world. So we're empowering patients around the world to do things like demanding genomic profiling, demanding, do I really need whole brain radiation? Can I do CyberKnife? We want our patients to be so smart that they can go in and at times teach the physician.
Well, that is a good goal. I could probably learn a few lessons myself. At least that's what Rick tells me. But
Keep them down. Keep them down.
what do you find most surprising things when you talk to patients about their care or their interactions with their physicians?
That's another great question. I learned something recently, and I told Pasi this a couple days ago. Don't ever believe that all patients are passive, and don't ever believe that all physicians are all-knowing, okay? So on that order, I think educating patients is top priority. But what patients tell us the most is when we are talking to them about their diagnosis and their treatment program, and we can tell it's not the right thing for them. And we're not physicians, so we can't give medical direction. But what we can do is get them a second opinion, sometimes a third opinion. So we'll say, let us get you a second opinion. And they say, no, I love my doctor. And I sometimes I just want to say, well, he or she is killing you. Let's move on here. But it's true. It's sad because most patients are passive, and it's harder to unlearn people than it is to teach people. And unlearning are the things that they have taken with them from the time they're born, to that decision-making process.
And do they ever come back to you after you've recommended they go to a second opinion?
Yes, and they've learned to love another doctor.
So you also, apart from the living room, the foundation is doing other educational activities in the community. Can you describe some of those?
Oh gosh, we discovered a couple years ago that 50% of all the clinical trials in the United States happen in 10 states. Right? So access to clinical trials is pretty tough. So consequently, we hear this statistic all the time that only 4% of patients are participating in clinical trials. They can't get to them. We have to change that. We have to bring clinical trials to the patients. So we have started a program called Community Lung Cancer Centers of Excellence. We're going out and we're finding the best community centers in the United States that can give academic type of care to patients. We have to work with them a little, get them doing more testing, getting them doing more multidisciplinary care, and all of those things, so patients can get access to all of that, and they have to participate in clinical trials too.
That's a wonderful effort. I think absolutely agree that number one, clinical trial participation is low, and of course that's the only way we get to figure out if our exciting or promising therapies actually will ever make it into real therapies if patients participate in clinical trials. But the real problem is exactly what you point out, that, and especially when we're dealing with patients that have genomic subsets or rare subsets of lung cancer, a HER2 mutant lung cancer patient that lives in Iowa, but the closest clinical trial is in Texas, it's impossible, practically impossible. And so, and they have to pay for it themselves. So that is a real practical issue. And I think as we think about how to optimize care for patients, this has to be part of the equation moving forward. How we're going to do that, I don't know, but I think making people aware of the problem, that this is an issue, and that we need to fix it is critical.
Yeah. Okay, so now we're going to turn this around, and I'm going to interview Pasi. Okay? So the first day I was here, I was in a media room with a major pharmaceutical company. And for the first time, since I was diagnosed with cancer, they were talking about the cure word.
Well, as you point out, in the last few years, what we as a community have been able to do in terms of approving therapies for patients with lung cancer, not only targeted therapies, but immunotherapies, which has sort of opened up the spectrum of what we can do in terms of therapies. I would say when I started in this business in the late 1990s, early 2000s, I rarely saw patients with metastatic lung cancer who lived longer than a year. And now it is very common to see patients who live 5 years, 6 years, 7 years. I have a few patients who have lived a decade with metastatic lung cancer. And they wouldn't be there today if we didn't have therapies. They wouldn't be there today if we didn't know what their genotype was, because we've been able to match the right therapies to the right patients. Now, that isn't everybody, of course, but I think it gives us hope and an optimism that it is possible. And most of the time, we're still talking about giving patients one drug at a time, one pill, one targeted therapy at a time, one immunotherapy at a time. And if we think about other diseases, think about other cancers that we can cure with combination therapies, testicular cancers, Hodgkin's lymphoma, non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. These are routinely treated with combination therapies. And yet for many of the advanced lung cancers, we're doing the single therapy approach. So once we're able to get to the combination approach, my hope is that years will become a common finding, and hopefully we'll ultimately get to the cure.
We have to do chronically managed first,
Absolutely.
right? So how do we beef that up?
Well, I think one of the points that you mentioned obviously was about chemotherapy and cisplatin and those kinds of things. One of the challenges we have is that we need to make our therapy such that the treatment isn't worse than the cancer, and living with therapies that give lots of side effects for a long period of time, even though they're controlling your disease, isn't necessarily great for one's quality of life. So that has to be what we think about in terms of development. We think of developing new drugs. We think about toxicities that happen in the very early parts of that development process, usually within a month. We rarely think about toxicities that happen at 3 months or 4 months or 6 months. But we have to sort of shift the way we think about developing therapies to make sure that that is an equally important component of the treatment, not just the efficacy. We want that to be, but it's got to be tolerable as well.
Which leads us round back to clinical trials. And we can't do all of those things without more patient participation in clinical trials, but we have to get the people that are initiating these clinical trials to be more demanding of the centers that are actually conducting the clinical trials and where they're conducting the clinical trials. You look at a clinical trial that's only in 2 sites. One's in San Francisco and the other is in Boston, right? There's only some people in Boston and San Francisco that are going to benefit from that. How do we fix that?
Right. So that is probably not a completely easy solution, but is one that is absolutely necessary. We absolutely need to be able to make sure that access is there for everybody. Working together as networks and collaborative groups and with our pharmaceutical sponsors, that is something that we need to be able to do. I think some of the other challenges are that sometimes trials are, there's such we demand so much of our patients on the trials, and sometimes that's a turnoff for patients to participate on clinical trials. And we have to sort of balance what we want to achieve scientifically and medically and clinically with what we're asking from our patients. And again, that is something that we need to, I think, continue to work on.
Okay, I have another question. Here's what I believe. We call clinical research from the bench to the patient and back to the bench, right? Does everybody agree with that? We do that. I think it's different than that. And I think if we could really do something transformational and say it's from the patient to the bench and back to the patient, because we're the ones that give up our tissue, and especially in lung cancer, to have a biopsy in your lung is serious business, almost as serious as having surgery. collapsed lungs and all kinds of things. Blood, plasma, all these samples Garden's working on come from patients. So if we start thinking that way and make patients partners and start asking them questions like, how do we get more participation in clinical trials? Here we have, the pharma companies sitting at round tables and people in this room sitting at round tables, but they're not asking the patient to sit at the table to come up with solutions to fix these issues. What do you think about that?
Patient has to be part of the team. I agree with you on that. And I think in the same regard, getting back to the tissue and the blood sample, we also need to make sure that we learn from every patient, exactly for the reasons that you mentioned. And that learning has to be something that we share with our colleagues through various forums, whatever they may be, publications, presentations, websites, et cetera, because that's how we get knowledge, and that's how we can use the knowledge to ultimately optimize our treatments or learn something special about the biology of this and that subtype of lung cancer that will help us think about then the signals, there's something that may work in this subtype and the other. But we need to learn and need to share that learning. And there are initiatives that are happening around the country. I'll just mention one initiative, this AACR Genie initiative, where different cancer centers around the country are depositing their sequencing data into a general database and making it publicly available. You need to make the data available so people can learn from it. But that's how you make, you make people part of the process. You make patients part of the process.
In our foundation, we just launched a patient registry. I don't even think you know this, but it's run by patients. All the data goes into the registry, entered by the patient. Then we can check in with their EMRs, validate the information they've put in, and then we can also upload scans and everything, necessary from their records, and we can do it worldwide. And there's no politics involved. None. There's no islands of information floating around out there in the ocean that's not being shared. It's all going to be shared worldwide, and we're putting the patients in the driver's seat.
Fantastic. That's a fantastic effort.